This is the first scenario, where James Crumbley had no idea what his son was capable of. He had no idea what his son was planning, and he had absolutely no idea that his son had access to those firearms. Also, as an aside, if it really were his son's gun, why was it hidden in James's bedroom? If it really were, why was it hidden? Not only in the bedroom, but in a location that James's son was not aware of. Sometime before November 26th of 2021, James's son wrote this in that journal notebook that was found. Exhibit 359, page 15. We know that it was before November 26th of 2021 because of some of the other statements that are around that journal entry, which you can look at if you'd like, but they reference a 9mm and a .22 caliber. And we know that there was not a 9mm in the house before November 26th of 2021. And even here, I don't know where my dad hid it, is a reference to .22 Cal-Tech. Even before November 26th of 2021, well before November 30th of 2021, James Crumbley's son didn't know where those firearms were. He told you he didn't, in his own words, in his own handwriting, which was verified by law enforcement. There's no evidence that James Crumbley had reason to believe his son would hurt anybody. I went over this a few minutes ago. Christy Gibson Marshall's testimony was that she had known James Crumbley and his son since approximately 4th grade. She told a story about James emailing her and asking about getting his son's report card or grades or something along those lines, and she responded and said, "Give him a hug for me." She testified about everything she saw, heard, and felt on November 30th of 2021. And as I said, she talked about seeing the shooter walking toward her with a gun in their hand. That as the shooter got closer, she recognized that it was James's son. And in those moments, she thought to herself, this can't be right. He's always been such a sweet kid. She was in such disbelief that was his son that she even tried to talk to him. As he's walking through the school with a firearm in his hand, she is trying to talk to him because she just can't believe that James's son was the shooter. And it was when he wouldn't respond that she realized it must be him. ATF agent Brandon testified there were no laws governing the storage of firearms. We went over this a little while ago. We talked about the various ways that you can store firearms. I outlined a few of them. He testified that people store firearms unloaded and unlocked, which in and of itself is not irresponsible or dangerous in 2021. Not putting a gun in a safe or using a trigger lock alone does not mean that that person is irresponsible. Now, ATF agent Brandon gave you his opinion about what he saw on that math homework. That opinion was given within the last couple of days. And with all due respect to Agent Brandon, his opinion on what he saw is irrelevant. It doesn't matter in this case. What matters in this case is what people thought that math homework showed on November 30th of 2021. And those people weren't concerned. They didn't see what Agent Brandon saw. They saw images that weren't concerning, that are common, that other kids write and draw about. The concern was that he was sad and needed to talk to someone. On November 26th of 2021, we saw evidence and heard testimony that James Crumbley went and bought the Sig Sauer at the gun store. James had been to that gun store on multiple occasions. We heard that testimony from Miss Back, who told you that she recognized him because he'd been there before. There were at least 2 other handgun purchases from that store, which we heard about, the .22 Derringer and the .22 Kel-Tec. James indicated, per Miss Back, that he'd been looking at the Sig Sauer for a few days, or a while. She couldn't really remember which one it was. She testified to both. That he knew that that was the one he wanted to purchase. So he did. You also heard Agent Brandon testify about the cable lock that was found in that Sig Sauer gun case. That the sleeve that the cable lock came in was essentially in pristine condition, that the keys were still inside the lock. Now, if you recall, that Sig Sauer was used. James bought that used. That sleeve being in pristine condition means that the person before him didn't use it either. You also heard that James did not purchase ammunition on November 26th of 2021 or at any point prior to November 30th of 2021 for that 9mm. There were purchases for ammunition when you would go to the gun range for the 22s, but James didn't purchase 9mm ammunition before November 30th of 2021. Cami Back told you that she had, that James didn't even talk to his son while they were standing there in the gun store. She didn't see any of that. She had no reason to believe that James was buying that gun for anyone but himself. And if she had, she couldn't have sold it. So obviously she didn't think that. On November 3rd of 2021, James Crumbley and his wife left a hotel that they had been staying in. Well, they had stayed in a couple different hotels, but they left a hotel that they had stayed in after the shooting on November 30th. You heard some testimony, or you heard some information that their residence had been made public, or there was media there, or there were things going on, and you can imagine. I mean, you all can imagine what that was like in the days following the shooting at Oxford High School. You heard Agent Brandon testify today that James and his wife were in and out of that building throughout the day on December 3rd of 2021. You heard testimony yesterday from Detective Willis that they arrived at approximately 11 a.m. and that they were there for the day. They were obviously arrested later that night. But you heard testimony that Luke Kirtley saw at least James Crumbley. You heard that James and Jennifer had both gone in and out of the building. Jennifer is his wife, had both gone in and out of the building throughout the day, various times to smoke, walk out to the car. Sometimes one of them went, sometimes both of them went. December 3rd, 2021 was a Friday. It was a work day. They were in and out. You heard that there were at least 14 cigarette butts found near their vehicle. You saw over 300 exhibits during this trial. You heard testimony from over a dozen witnesses. None of them told you that James knew what his son was planning. None of them told you that James knew that his son was a danger to anyone. None of them told you that James knew that his son knew where those firearms were hidden. None of them told you that James knew that his son had somehow obtained access to the firearms that he had been hiding. None of them told you that. Because on November 30th of 2021, James Crumbley had no knowledge about any of that. He had no knowledge, and he had no reason to suspect what his son was planning to do later that morning on November 30th of 2021. Now, every time I do a trial, I have somebody tell me that they think of a reasonable doubt that I may not have thought of. So, think of your own. You don't have to agree with all of mine. You don't have to agree with any of mine. You can come up with your own reasonable doubt. Based on the evidence that you've seen, the testimony that you've heard, your collective memories, you can come up with your own. You're not limited to what I've come up with, and you can certainly reach your own reasonable doubt conclusions on your own. And as you deliberate, think about the things you did not hear during this trial. Think about the things that you were told you would hear during the opening statements, that you would hear how the shooter gained access to that gun. You didn't hear that. That you will hear from school officials regarding their concerns about the math worksheet. You heard that they were concerned about sadness, not about danger to others. That you will hear that the need for immediate parental intervention was necessary. You didn't hear that. In fact, you heard the opposite. You heard that Sean Hopkins said that James and his wife, that they wanted James and his wife to have their son talk to someone or to at least make arrangements within 48 hours. No one testified that immediate parental intervention was necessary on November 30th of 2021 during the meeting with Sean Hopkins and Nick Ejak. No one testified that there was a need for immediate intervention of any kind, discipline, mental health, or otherwise. You did not hear testimony detailing how the shooter obtained access to the SIG Sauer. You just saw in his journal that he said he had access, but you don't know how that happened. No one testified that the shooter knew that there was any sort of code to open the gun safe. There's been some talk about the code that was used on the gun safe with the Keltec and the SIG Sauer. There was no testimony that the shooter even knew about that code or what it was. You did not hear any mutual concern for the shooter's well-being from his best friend's dad, who you saw text with between James and his friend's dad, who obviously has experience with mental health with his own child, from what you can see in the texts. And even that man didn't express any concern for James's son. In fact, on November 30th of 2021, he texted James, said, "I hope everyone's okay." No one told you that James Crumbley was aware of the texts or videos that were sent to his son's friend. In fact, they all testified, all of the witnesses testified they couldn't tell you that. They couldn't tell you that he was aware. You don't know if the shooter ever actually did do what he told his friend he was going to do. He was going to tell his parents about this, that, and the other. You heard no evidence that he actually did. You heard no evidence that he actually told James any of that. And when you go back for deliberations, think about everything that James Crumbley did not know. He did not know he had to protect others from his son. He did not know he wasn't exercising ordinary care in the way he was storing his firearm because he didn't know that his son was planning what he was planning. He did not know that it was reasonably foreseeable that his son would commit these offenses. He had taught his son firearm safety. He had taught his son to be familiar with those firearms because they were in the house. He had no idea what his son was planning to do. In fact, no one that interacted with James Crumbley's son on November 30th of 2021 knew what was going to happen a short time later. No one. This is what I dislike the most. The prosecution gets to stand up and make a rebuttal statement, and I have to sit down and I don't get an opportunity to respond. That's how trial rules work. The court has told you that. That's just how it works. But the hard part for me is that every time I hear a rebuttal from the prosecution, I think of all these things that I want to say. Think of all these responses that I can give. So what I'm going to ask you to do, we've gotten to know each other over the last couple of weeks. You've seen how I am in court. You've heard the questions that I ask. So when you go back to deliberate, think to yourselves, what would Mariell say? What would she say about this? What would she say about that? Because unfortunately, I can't tell you. I join with the prosecution in thanking you all for the time and attention that you've paid to this case. You have heard some of the most emotional testimony and seen some of the most difficult things that I can imagine a juror could see. And you likely may not be able to forget it. But what you're all doing in these chairs is of the utmost importance. And I thank you for the time and attention that you've paid. Early on in this case, during our opening statements, the prosecution and I both asked you to follow the law. And I'm going to ask you again. Follow the law. The judge will instruct you on what the law is. She will give you very clear instructions. Please, follow the law. Review the evidence. Review the instructions. And follow the law. Because I'm confident that if you do that, each of you will have at least one reasonable doubt. And your vote will be not guilty. And your vote should be not guilty. Not just because you have reasonable doubts, but because James Crumbley is not guilty.